Rousseau, are we ready to go?
You're live, Your Worship.
All right, Council, I'd like to call this committee the whole meeting of January 12th, 2023 to order. I'm going to ask for adoption of the agenda, and I want to amend the agenda to include a CAO snow removal update under 12 communications. So someone want to make that motion for me? Councilor Orlando, seconded by Councilor Cherry. All in favor? Motion's carried. Thank you. Adoption of the minutes of the Committee of the Whole for November 10th. Someone want to make that motion for me, please? Councilor Cherry, seconded by Councilor Palmer. All in favor? Motion's carried. Any business arising from those minutes? Seeing none, I'm going to go right on into business of the day, staff reports, review of fees and charges. Any comments or presentation, Ms. Floyd, regarding that?
So, Your Worship, no presentation. Basically, this is just for a discussion so that you guys can see what the proposed changes are. Kind of across the board, we've done about a 5.5% increase. There are a few additions, a few things that have been removed, but other than that, it's pretty straightforward. We will be bringing this forward in the form of a bylaw on January 24th for consideration, but we're kind of open. All of the management team went through their schedules, made some changes, and we're open to having questions. If you have any questions why something's gone up or why it hasn't.
Any comments or concerns from council? Councilor Lucio.
Thanks, Mayor Schultz. Just under the parks and the arena pricing, I know there's been talk that our arena prices are lower comparatively to other municipalities. Is there any talk of raising them past the 5%?
So
Mr. Nato's online. Any comments, Mr. Nato, regarding arena pricing on fees and charges?
Thank you, Your Worship. So we recently did a review of other municipalities in terms of cost comparison for fees, and the proposed 5.5% increase is pretty much consistent with the fees that other municipalities charged. The only one where we felt was still a bit low was the fee established for the Junior B hockey team. So we did bump that up from 89 to 140 an hour for their game time. And I have had conversations with the general manager who seemed open to this fee increase at the time that we had the discussion. There still might be some room to play with that fee, but it's probably best that we do that in increments rather than increasing the fee a significant amount all at once.
Follow up, Councilor?
No, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Nato. I appreciate that and appreciate the way you're wording that. So I've gone through all of the fees and charges proposed, and actually spent a bit of time on the cemetery fees because we're increasing those. We kind of go up that 5% every year, and I think everything's appropriate. Under the new fees and charges, there was a proposed increase for one of the columbariums, the Mount Begbie columbarium, and we have only one or two niche spaces left in that. So I asked for those fees to be left at last year's fees. A little bit of an enticement if somebody wants to go into that columbarium. It's a little less priced than the other columbariums, and I'd like to utilize getting those niches basically sold. So that's what we've done there. Otherwise, all the other prices are appropriate and definitely in line with what other communities are doing for cemetery fees. So I'm content with all of the fees and charges, and having heard that each department has weighed in on fees and charges, both for development services and for engineering. Mr. Black, Mr. Simon, you're all okay with those fees as they are proposed, I'm assuming, because it's at our table. So All right, any other comments regarding that? So seeing no other comments, Ms. Floyd, it would automatically come to council the way it is written. You don't need a motion to bring it to council, it will automatically come.
Yes.
All right, good. Let's move on to the next finance review of City of Revelstoke debt. And so basically we have
Ken's here.
Ken's here, okay. And any comments? I see both Justin and Ken are here. Any comments regarding debt or any basically any report that you would like to speak on, Ken or Justin, before I ask council if they have any questions?
If I could just review certain aspects of the report that may be helpful, Mr. Your Worship.
Yes, that'd be great. Thank you.
If I could just share my screen, that would be helpful as well.
Okay. Ms. Rousseau, can you make that happen?
Yeah, you should have the ability to just share your screen, Ken.
You got me?
We got you. We don't have anything on the screen. Oh, there we do. We have now. Thank you, Ken.
So as part of the financial planning process, we've been looking at the city's debt, including its existing debt levels, which are at the range of 11.6 million, with 6 million attributable to the general fund, 1.3 million to the water fund, 1.6 million to Big Eddy Water, and 2.7 million to the sewer utility. And so in terms of how that debt is serviced, in terms of annual principal and interest payments, part of the water debt, approximately 20%, is covered through a local area service levy on tax notices. And of course, in Big Eddy, that's also covered 100% by a levy on the LAS. And in the sewer, part of the debt servicing payments are covered through DCCs and part through an LAS as well. So a good portion of the utility debt is recoverable in terms of the debt payments. Now, when we looked at the city's prior financial plan, there was some debt that was planned to come forward in terms of the school safety projects. We're due for a borrowing of $2 million. There was additional debt anticipated in terms of the new wastewater treatment facility, which was, of course, a good part of grant coverage was provided for that project. And then there was some debt for the greenhouse gas reducing compost project. So in terms of interest over the prescribed time that these borings were going to occur, for example, in the school safety project, the total interest would have been roughly $1 million. The interest borrowing on the sewer debt, which was supposed to be borrowed at 7 million, was 5.2 million. And on the greenhouse gas compost project, the total interest over 5 years would have been 125,000. So the tack we've taken in the financial plan is to avoid some of this debt or minimize it in case of the sewer debt. But we are financing internally the school safety project so that external borrowing won't be required. And same with the greenhouse gas reducing compost project. So we believe that by saving interest and putting that money aside, that the city will be better off in the future. And we are looking at ways of minimizing the sewer debt as well. So the city has a debt management policy that has been around for a few years. And we believe that this policy is still very much relevant to the city, and that the city can minimize future debt by following the policy, mainly proactively building up its reserves, only considering external borrowing for more critical projects, including local area service projects, and then examining ways of funding DCC projects with internal borrowing and/or the building up of DCC reserves. And that the best way for the city to move forward is to increase its reserves and create internal borrowing opportunities from those reserves. Because when one has that internal capacity to fund its own internal debt for projects, that debt can be paid off at any time. And you're not locked into a 20-year period, for example, through external borrowing with the MFA. So there's a lot more flexibility if the city can internally borrow for key projects, and as an alternative to fund those projects outright through building up the reserves. So this is the tack that we have taken in the financial planning process. And if we look at the city's reserve and surplus levels, they're projected to be about 32 million at the end of 22. And of course, some of that is restricted funds that can be only used for specific purposes. But the health of these reserve levels is directly related to the ability of the city to minimize future debt. And so the financial planning process is looking closely at building up these reserves as well, again, so that projects can be funded outright and/or by internally borrowing from specific reserves, which is an allowable strategy under the community charter, of course. So what we're doing is we're not going to be borrowing in the financial plan for the school safety project or the greenhouse gas project. And we, as I say, we are looking at minimizing debt for the wastewater treatment facility. And so we are looking at all means to do that, because we believe the city will be better off in the future if it can put aside money that would otherwise gone to interest. So if we look at, we did have an opportunity to get some information on what the debt levels were in some other communities in comparison to the city of Revelstoke. And I'll just go to that quickly now. First of all, of course, we looked at the population of some comparable communities, those being Castlegar, Fernie, Golden, Kimberly, Nelson, Salmon Arm, and Tofino, which were gauged to be relatively comparable to Revelstoke for various reasons. But if you look at the debt levels in those other communities in comparison to Revelstoke, the total debt outstanding in Revelstoke, and this was at the end of 21 because that was the year the latest statistics were for. Revelstoke had approximately $12.7 million worth of debt outstanding, which was the next highest and compared to Salmon Arm, which of course is a much larger community. And next to Revelstoke was Castlegar at 12.5 million. And if you look at the debt servicing costs for those comparable communities, you can see that the highest is Nelson. And that is a bit of an anomaly because Nelson's borrowing is related to their electrical utility. So it's a bit of a unique situation. But you can see that in terms of annual debt servicing costs compared to Nelson and Salmon Arm, Revelstoke is the next highest. And if you look at per capita debt, the highest is Revelstoke at about $1,500 per capita, and next is Castlegar, followed by Salmon Arm. These statistics are very much community-based, and each community is very much unique in terms of its assessment base. So you have to take these comparisons with a grain of salt, but they do sometimes give an indication of broad trends. So this is presented as an overview of what direction we're taking with debt in the city's financial plan, and I would welcome any questions right now.
Thanks, Ken. I think I'm appreciative of the way you're going about it. And when money was cheap, it looked good that we could go out and borrow. But we've had this kind of plan for a while to put money into reserves and look at things. And obviously now with interest rates going up, it's definitely been a benefit. So I appreciate that. But I'm looking at it, and from what I've seen, you know, even 8-10 years ago, our debt level seems to be going down, even though we're still high per capita. And appreciate the fact that we're paying off some of this debt as we move forward. But I'll go to council. Any comments or questions for Ken regarding what he's proposing?
Just a quick question. The per capita debt load, what census data were we using there? Was it census data just for our population, or?
It's based on our census population. I believe it was in 2021.
They finally.
8,500.
8,500?
Yeah.
So realistically half our actual population?
Yeah.
Okay.
I take it they're using the federal census.
Yeah. Using the federal census, is that correct, Ken?
Yeah.
I think it was BC census.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Because the federal did one too.
And what's our, what are we, about 16 or 15,000 if we look
I
at
think Aaron would tell us insight 14,500, something like that.
2,750 December of 2019.
2019. Okay.
Follow-up question?
No, it's probably a lot better than it looks on the chart.
Yeah. Any other comments or questions, Council? Councilor Orlando.
Your worship, through the chair, I would appreciate just sort of a refresher for me on what our debt sort of ceiling or limits is and what regulates that, such as is that MFA advice or is that financial advice? It just would be helpful for me to refresh my memory on how that works.
And comment on that, can you?
Yes, the debt ceiling and levels are regulated by a regulation under the community charter, and they're a calculation based on revenue, including your tax revenue. And so in the financial plan, we will actually be providing some information on debt ceiling levels. And Revelstoke is not anywhere near its debt ceiling level, as is the case with many other communities, because debt ceiling levels based on revenue are quite high. So Revelstoke, and I'm just throwing out a number, maybe only at 20% of their ceiling level, but it is dependent on your revenues, and mainly the revenues coming from property taxation.
Follow-up, Council?
No, your worship, great. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Thanks, Ken. Any other comments or questions for Ken? I see no other questions. Ken, do you have anything else that you would like to talk about?
No, thank you, Your Worship.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate your time and your presentation.
Okay. Take care.
All right, Council, let's move on to item 9C, non-traditional residential accommodation. So discussion paper. Do we have a presentation on that, Mr. Simon?
Through your worship, we do have a presentation prepared that's a general overview of the information provided in the report that we can provide if council wants us to.
Okay. Yes, nodding yes, please.
Through your worship, as always, if there's any issues with seeing my screen on Zoom, just please let us know and interrupt me. So we are talking what we're referring to as non-traditional residential accommodation today. So this is based on the notice of motion that council had passed at the December 13th, 2022 regular council meeting. So this is a report that's been prepared by senior management to respond to that notice of motion. So we'll give a little bit of a background on what the context of the current situation is, get into the details on the current regulatory framework, and conclude with some options that are available to the city for regulating this type of what we're referring to as non-traditional residential accommodation. So going over some background, accommodation or occupation of unauthorized residential accommodation is a growing challenge, something that's happening throughout the province. BC is not, or Revelstoke is not the only community that is facing this challenge. And what we mean when we say unauthorized residential accommodation, non-traditional residential accommodation, people living in residential dwelling units such as RVs that are not authorized to be used as permanent residential accommodation. So what's causing this? Well, it's no secret in Revelstoke, we do have a housing crunch. We have a housing supply shortage, low vacancy rates, and overall significantly increased cost of housing in the city, especially when you look at compared to other interior communities. Increases in cost of living. You'll see in the background of the report, the living wage analysis done by the Community Economic Development Group paints a pretty good picture that the community is dealing with increases in cost of living that it's felt across the province, across the nation, but quite acutely within Revelstoke. And in some cases, this is a desired lifestyle for some people, you know, living the quote unquote van lifestyle, minimalist, not wanting to have a mortgage. That is something that also factors into this. So what does this result in? It's a situation where individuals may be permanently residing in accommodation that doesn't necessarily comply with local city bylaw regulations as well as provincial code regulations. So just some context that I think is important to help frame the conversation from the city's perspective is, what are we doing to address this housing shortage that we have right now? Well, there's lots that the city's been undertaking in. So approving more multi-unit residential development, the chart on the right here shows, and it's taken right from the report, 650 units over the last few years, you know, over half of which are either constructed or under construction. This includes renovations to existing buildings that BC Housing had picked up, Columbia Gardens, River's Edge, as well as looking at some substantial zoning amendments to our bylaw to allow for what are referred to as accessory dwelling units. So that could be secondary suites, a garden suite, which is just a detached subordinate dwelling unit, or a carriage suite, which is the same thing as a garden suite, but with a garage on the first floor. One of the other things that we did with the previous zoning bylaw update that a lot of municipalities haven't taken advantage of yet is allowing for secondary suites within multi-unit residential buildings. So a duplex can now have a suite in it, as well as row houses. So there is a lot of work that has been undertaken, but certainly acknowledge that there's more to be done. So what is the current regulatory framework? Well, really importantly, because a lot of these terms are sometimes interchangeable. There's a lot of new emerging terminology that's been coming out to respond to this type of development. So it's important that we all start from a baseline of what are we actually talking about here. So what we've broken it down to is basically 3 different types of residential accommodation that is regulated within the zoning bylaw. So mobile homes, these are units that are not on wheels. They're factory built. They're placed on a foundation. They're suitable for year-round occupancy. They're only permitted in zones where mobile homes are a listed use, and they need to be built to CSA standards. Tiny homes, that's another one, micro homes, whatever term you want to place to it. Essentially, when these are on wheels, they are considered recreational vehicles. If they're off wheels, then they are considered a single detached dwelling, or they could even be used as a garden suite. Garden suites within our bylaw don't have any minimum unit size. So if you're able to build a quote unquote tiny home that meets the provisions in the BC Building Code or CSA standards, then you can build it as small as you like. And then recreational vehicles. They're vehicles that are designed to be used for temporary living or travel. They're permitted in all zones that allow for campgrounds. And again, these need to meet CSA standards. So one of our colleagues who's on the call today for the next item had shared this flow chart on the right, which is, I think, very helpful to just give a good snapshot of what the regulatory framework is. If something is not on wheels, then you can see on the left, needs to comply with BC Building Code, CSA standards. If it's on wheels and it's used for seasonal residents, it's considered a recreational vehicle, then needs to comply with CSA standards. If it's used as a full-time residence, we have to make sure that there's this clarity and understanding that the provincial regulatory framework does not allow for this. There is nothing in the BC Building Code, nothing under the CSA standards that allows for something like a recreational vehicle to be inhabited on a permanent basis. They are considered motor vehicles, and there is nothing in the provincial regulations that would allow a building inspector to sign off for these to be lived in permanently year-round. So what are some options that we have? Well, they're outlined in the report, and we'll go through each one of them. So a temporary use permit. A private landowner could apply for a temporary use permit to allow RVs to be lived in for seasonal purposes. This is something that is subject to an application from a private landowner. TUPs can be issued anywhere in the city. They are subject to council approval. They can be issued for a 3-year term and renewed once for a total of 6 years. And one of the great things about temporary use permits is you can craft site-specific conditions within them to ensure that the development is abiding and aligning with what the city's rules and regulations are. If a TUP was issued for permanent occupation of RVs or tiny homes on wheels, there are legal implications for this. The city is not the authority having jurisdiction under the Building Act, and this could certainly be viewed as the city trying to regulate something that it does not have the authority to regulate, i.e. permanent residential accommodation. Another option is looking at our current regulations for campgrounds. So in a nutshell, our zoning bylaw is quite limited in terms of where campgrounds are currently permitted. There's only a couple zones that allows for them. And campgrounds are intended to be for temporary recreation purposes. So someone under the bylaw right now is only allowed to stay there for a maximum of 30 days. Anything more than 30 days, they're technically not permitted to stay there. Now, enforcement of this does become a challenge, because what happens if someone picks up, drives off for the day and then comes back? Does that count as another visit and they can stay for another 30 days? These are all some of the administrative implications and considerations that we need to be cognizant of. One of the things that you could look at doing is extending the length of stay in campgrounds. That's what some other municipalities have done. One of the items to consider with this, though, is if someone's allowed to stay in a campground for up to 6 months, you're going to start seeing skirting come up around the RVs, decks, little additions on there, and they tend to morph into almost informal mobile home parks. So that's certainly a consideration, and there are some enforcement elements of that would need to be considered if this is the route we want to go. The other item is in Revelstoke, we have heavy snow load requirements. These RVs are not constructed to meet minimum snow load requirements. And again, same thing as temporary use permits. This is subject to private campground operators wanting to pursue this path. Another option could be a moratorium on enforcement. So council could look at authorizing a moratorium on enforcement, which wouldn't necessarily legalize the use. It would just cease the city's bylaw group from enforcing on anyone who's permanently residing in a recreational vehicle or a tiny home on wheels within city limits. This is an option that would require legal review to determine whether or not there's any liability for the city, should there be any issues that arise from someone residing in this type of accommodation, as well as making sure that this is something that's within the city's jurisdictional ability to actually do. Items to consider: this could cause a proliferation of this type of use, especially when there's not adequate servicing, garbage collection. There can be concerns with illegal dumping of sanitary waste. So these are all items that would need to be considered if there was a blanket moratorium. And it could result in further accommodation in city parks that ultimately impact other user groups of these parks. Some municipalities have been exploring, limited permitting options, you could say. Some of them are doing it through temporary use permits, but the city could look at instituting some type of permitting program that would allow RVs or tiny homes to be lived in on seasonal basis. So you could look at it on private land, private residential lots. could say, you know, up to 6 months, someone can live in an RV on a residential lot. You need to come in and get a special permit through the Planning and Development Services Group. And there could be some stipulations or a liability waiver that needs to be signed. This is something that would be basically creating a brand new process. There are administrative implications associated with this. You know, it would certainly have an impact on resource capacity within the city to make sure that we can administer this appropriately. Something that would likely require legal review. We got to be very cognizant that we are not venturing into the realm of trying to regulate something that we don't have the authority to regulate. This doesn't solve the problems with snow load and ventilation of people living in recreational vehicles. And it could also have an impact on parking during the winter months. If you have someone parked in a driveway living in an RV, in all likelihood, we're going to see more on-street parking, which does have an impact for snow removal. One of the other items to consider as well, if this is an option, there could be some individuals in the community, and staff are currently, dedicating a good bit of time for enforcement of short-term rentals. And this could result in some people trying to use this system for short-term rental purposes, which would not be its intent. The last option is the same thing, trying to create a permitting system to allow for seasonal occupation of recreational vehicles or tiny homes on wheels, but trying to find public land. So if the city has some land where this would be an appropriate use, this could be an option. Some items to consider in addition to the ones that I've mentioned on the previous slide. What is the highest and best use of the city land? Is this something that, what is the opportunity cost by having this on city-owned land that we could otherwise be doing, as well as the impact on public spaces and infrastructure. So if this was allowed in one of the parks, for instance, where we have public washrooms, there could be an impact on that public infrastructure. And with all the options that we've kind of gone through now, there are additional considerations, and the intent of providing these is to help enable and facilitate the council discussion today that would ultimately lead to some next steps for staff to consider. So what is the role of the nonprofit sector in securing housing for those that are currently living in non-traditional accommodation, and what other community resources are out there? Those are things that are not necessarily within the control of the city, but this is a city, this is a community that has a lot of resources available, and I'm always really taken aback by the sophistication of the nonprofit sector. What are the needs and the wants of the individuals that are living in recreational vehicles? Are some of them doing this as part of their lifestyle, which is certainly, we are a resort municipality. You will have people that are living out here for a season to go skiing, and they are choosing to live this way. What is the environmental impact from non-compliant operators, illegal dumping, no appropriate sanitary servicing, unsightly considerations, incapacity of city staff to respond to complaints, city services, garbage collection and recycling, connecting an RV or tiny home to municipal servicing? That's a huge challenge. So most of these are what we call truck in, pump out type of services, where they have to go to a sandy dump, and they're relying on on-site services rather than centralized municipal services. Many existing RVs and tiny homes, a lot of them are quite old. Some of them have been constructed by the individual themselves, and they don't meet basic life and safety standards from a BC building code perspective or a CSA perspective. And that does pose some questions about liability for the city if we do allow and authorize this type of use. Taxation impact. If we have more of these residential units that are coming into the city, they are not taxable because they are a temporary dwelling. So that is certainly a consideration for council. And then largely as well, depending on which route, if any, council chooses to go, there are administrative implications. We have a very busy 2023 year that's already lined up. And there certainly are a lot of projects that are underway. And if we are given direction to create some type of permitting system to regulate this type of development, that will certainly have implications for projects that are currently being worked on by city staff. So this is a general overview of the staff report, and don't have anything else from my side, but if there's any questions from council, we are certainly here to help answer them.
Great, thanks, Mr. Simon. Questions? Ms. Braun, you have a comment or a question?
Just a statement to our staff to share. We just got the hot off the press, the emergency shelter housing report for all of 2022. And from January 1st to December 31st, 2022, 19 clients that accessed the emergency support program or shelter program. had been living in their vehicles, and they accounted for 234 nights in the shelter. Just to use some numbers on that.
Well, thank you for that. Comments, questions from council? Councilor Lucia.
Thanks, Mayor Schultz. Just wondering, when you say about seasonal occupation, how long is the time frame on that? Is there a time frame on a seasonal occupation?
Through your worship, the maximum that we have seen elsewhere would be 6 months. So generally, once you start getting over 6 months, that's when you're going to start venturing into the permanent occupation. And one thing I do just want to mention, we do have, you might notice, we have our building inspectors on the call today. They're not always in council. So if you guys have any technical questions as well, do bear in mind that we do have the inspectors on to help provide clarity.
Perfect, appreciate that. Any other comments or concerns? Councilor Cherry.
Have we had any info from the province about updates to the BC building code to allow for this, since it's a pretty common issue that a lot of places are facing?
Through your worship to Councillor Cherry, not as far as I'm aware, but I also would like to get insight from our senior building inspector, Mr. Gibbs, if he should be on the call here. He might have some additional insight to provide on that matter.
Yeah, I'm on the call here through your worship. We haven't heard anything from the province yet as far as any timelines for implementing anything or regulations regarding tiny homes. The conversation has started, but we have not been given any information about timelines.
Follow-up question, Council.
What are we looking at for liability on the city if we were to go forward with any of these options?
So through your worship to Councillor Cherry, and again, this is certainly subject to council direction to staff. The way that I would envision this playing out, if there is a specific option that council would like staff to explore further, then we could have a more well-vetted report on that specific option that would look at getting legal review on it, so that we could come back to council with a more wholesome conversation about what that does look like. It would depend on which option we go with, to be honest. And some of the options certainly carry further risk than others do. And one thing to also consider is, if we are looking at how do we create a separate permitting system for this, how do we allow for it for a longer length of time rather than 30 days, and maybe campgrounds are the appropriate way to go. We are going to be embarking on a zoning bylaw comprehensive review. Council could certainly also look at giving staff direction for items to consider as part of that comprehensive review.
Not directly about that. Can you give us some examples of other municipalities in BC that have gone forward with something like this, whether it be a TUP or one of the other processes?
Yeah, Euclid's gone forward with temporary use permits for up to 6 months. So that's again going to be subject to private landowners making an application to the city to ultimately allow for seasonal accommodation. For them, they're looking at doing it during the summer months to specifically support workforce housing. And that's any municipalities we've come across. I'm trying to recall, there was 2 others as well that Ms. Hartling had done some research on previously. And they're all looking at either a temporary use permit or a specific permit that the city issues to say you can do it for up to 6 months. One of the considerations with that is enforcement. How do we make sure that these individuals are ceasing the activities after the 6-month period? And how many people are actually going to take advantage of this? What is the scale and scope of the impact for city staff to actually be able to administer this appropriately?
Okay, I got another comment. I got a bit of background on Euclid and how they, what they were looking at and how they approved everything. They were hoping to get close to 100 applications for this. They got to about 25 and only 6 were approved that actually met their standards or weren't withdrawn. And it was solely around workforce housing. You had to be working in town at an establishment for the next 6 months. I don't know if you'd call that a win, getting 6 instead of 80, but just a little bit of background.
Okay, appreciate that. So Luciano, you have a question?
Yeah, just on the moratorium of enforcement. I understand that we don't want to have a full moratorium because that will increase the amount of RVs on the road, but is there any way to look into RVs and stuff that have been ticketed through bylaw for residents that have been priced out of the housing market to give them a moratorium, but still have enforcement on RVs that are coming from outside of town?
Through your worship, I would have to defer to Ms. Floyd on that. My instincts would say we're getting very, very dangerously close to regulating user and having a specific set of rules for one users compared to other users for the same type of activity, which is a challenge, but I would defer to Ms. Floyd on that.
So Councillor Lucille, I agree with Paul Simon in that we can't really have two separate rules, because how does that hold up in court? The bylaw officers it's black and white. There is no gray there. So if something went to court, we would never win. And then what are we trying to tell the public?
Okay.
So I want to make a comment with this because we go back to what we had in the past when we were dealing with animal control, but a councillor that asked for a moratorium on that sort of stuff. And coming back from legal, actually coming back from government law, challenge has been abandoned because the bylaw remains the law of the land and any lawfully passed bylaw of the mayor and council. So mayor and council can't direct staff to have a moratorium on that sort of thing because it's not legal. We can't get involved in the operations part and enforce that issue. And then that's where liability comes back on us as a council, and could come back on us. I'm not sure personally, but definitely as a council. So just want you to be aware of that sort of thing. Any other comments or questions? Councillor Lyman?
Yeah, Your Worship, thank you. I have just a general comment and then one question of staff. I think the topic is, obviously housing related topics are really big and important. I feel that from what I've seen around the province and to some extent here, how to approach this is complicated. There's a lot of potential downsides. We could get into them, dozens of them. But my question is this: is there a best practice that staff would recommend? I mean, given the context that we're in, what sort of direction, if staff was wanting to recommend that we take an action, even a temporary one, what would you recommend or prioritize as being something that's workable?
So, Mr. Simon, do you want to kind of touch on that, or do you feel we need to go to Ms. Floyd or Mr. Parliament?
Through your worship, I certainly have feedback from a planning perspective, and maybe Ms. Floyd or Mr. Parliament can add on to anything that I'm missing. But from my view, from a planning perspective, the most appropriate way to deal with this, given the current regulatory framework from the province down to the city, is someone who's living in an RV is considered a camper. So campground regulations within the zoning bylaw, and looking at ways that we can improve our campground regulations, maybe improve opportunities for zoning that accommodates more campgrounds and a greater length of stay, is the best, and in my view, really the only option that we have under the current regulatory framework. Until the BC building code is changed to allow for more diverse types of residential accommodation, then this is the box that we're working in right now. So it becomes really challenging, and we start to get dangerously close to this line of trying to regulate something that we are not the authority having jurisdiction under the Building Act. And our only tools right now are campgrounds. And the way that the framework is set up right now, if we have an individual who's living in an RV at a campground, technically they're only allowed there for 30 days. But if they drive off and they come back the next day, that 30-day clock would typically start back up again. So I know that it's not necessarily getting at the root of the issue, but in my view, from a planning perspective and a zoning perspective, this is the only option that we really do have available to us. And Ms. Floyd and Mr. Parliament may be able to add on or have a more creative suggestion than what I've put forward there.
Thanks, Paul. So I think that as a council, your job is governance. So you have to do that through policy, bylaws. I don't think that we can bring the emotion into it, which I get that homelessness and people not being able to afford things hits home. But we have to figure out a way to improve that, like Paul was saying, through policy or bylaw, where we amend our bylaws to make it easier for those individuals.
Oh,
No, your worship, that's great, thank you.
any comments or questions from council? Mr. Palmer, do you have a comment?
Yeah, yes. First of all, thank you, Mr. Simon. A very, very well done report. It's a tricky issue to navigate because we're in this sort of housing crisis within the city, and we're all wanting to do something, but the risk is there's lots of risks as to on taking innovative approaches. So I think the report was really well done. I'd like to, Mayor Sulz, I would just like to highlight that in dealing with the housing crisis, there is a lot that's been done in the last couple of years, a lot of it coming out of the planning department and from administration, specifically the ability for garden suites, carriage houses, dramatic improvement for potential inventory coming onto the market, including, as Mr. Simon described, garden suites can be really tiny. They can be tiny homes. The other is we have a lot of housing coming online, both in the private and public sector. So affordable housing, and a lot of that has been enabled over the last couple of years through expediting processes and getting some of the red tape and bureaucracy out of the way. So there is a lot of units that are going to be coming online in the next year or two. And so this is also addressing the housing issues. And the main reason I bring this up is that the city has done a lot in addressing housing and addressing affordable housing. There's much more to be done. But I think it's important for us to highlight some of the success that we've had to date. That's my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're starting to see some things come on stream, definitely with what Mr. Simon, Mr. Black, and their departments have done in the last 6 months to a year, just to get rid of some of the red tape and some of the process we're seeing in the comments that we're hearing. Mr. Parliament and I are hearing from local contractors that they're very pleased with how we're going through things. Today, just after lunch, we had the privilege of being with Canadian Pacific Rail as they opened their housing. 48 units are now active and they're filling them with staff. It took them a little over 6 months to build these units from start to finish. So there's potential here with things as we move forward, and as we get out of the way and get things more streamlined, I'm hoping that we can see more things come to fruition. But the stuff that we've got either already being built, has been built, or is in the queue is phenomenal. And I have to attribute our staff to their ability to work and want to work with the community for that. So although the emotional part is that some people have been living in a home and then for whatever reason they've been forced out and into vehicles or whatever, that is so disappointing for all of us to hear. But again, as Ms. Floyd has said, our job is governance and about how do we put things in place so that we can help get housing built for those who. Is it a panacea? Is it? No, but it's some way to move forward. So I just thanks for the staff for what they've done. Any other comments or questions, Councillor Staples?
I think this has come up before, but have we explored the opportunity of potentially creating some year-round RV camping at Williamson Lake. I know the infrastructure isn't there and may not help us in the short term, but it might be a long-term goal. And then potentially, we could, at least defer people off the streets of Revelstoke during the winter. We could create some kind of temporary use permit for people to camp there for a season, and then.
I think staff have, they kind of, definitely we don't have the infrastructure. It's just not winterizable, and we can't move the snow in the winter. And I think, Mr. Nato has repeated that to us many times. That I can't make comments, whether we should be going down that road or not going down that road. At what cost do we put things in from a community perspective? Because this would be on the taxpayer to fund this sort of thing, in my mind. But any comment, Mr. Black, from you regarding that sort of thing?
Thank you, Your Worship. As you've indicated, Williamson, we don't have the infrastructure, nor do we have the bandwidth to keep that accessible year-round with vehicles parked there. Is there an opportunity perhaps at another location? Certainly something that we could consider. However, it's not in the pipeline right now as a priority. Should council direct staff to pursue that? We have a sandy dump out on Powerhouse Road and some land out there.
And so, that's something that definitely that could be looked at. My concern is we have plans for that area, do we not? Didn't we recently just plan what we're going to be doing with some of that stuff out there? It's a question.
It hasn't been presented to us yet.
What's that?
It hasn't been presented to us yet.
Okay. Ms. Braun and Mr. Black.
We have that for topic for discussion.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, there's a proposal to do a master plan for that entire area, which could encompass maybe something that was suggested by Mr. Black.
Okay, so I did that cart before the horse thing. All right, any other comments, questions, Councillor Cherry?
Just a question for Paul, through your worship. Paul, can you remind us of our zoning bylaws? Are we allowed to have garden suites in R2 and R3 homes if there's already a secondary suite?
Through your worship to Councillor Cherry, no. And within those zones, garden suites would only be permitted if a single family dwelling is on site. If there's a multi-unit dwelling like a duplex or a row house, then they're also not permitted to have garden suites and carriage suites. I will note though that staff, and you guys will get a more wholesome presentation in February committee of the whole. That is one of the big elements we do want to examine with this zoning bylaw update. Where does council want to go with greater allowances for that, what we call gentle densification? So it is coming down the pipe.
Awesome, I appreciate that. From what I'm hearing, we don't really have a lot of options other than, from a policy change point of view, other than looking at a TUP on private lands, or looking at changing our allowable time limits on campgrounds.
At this point, that's where we're at. It doesn't mean that we can't have conversation. Once we kind of look at, maybe some of our inventory of our own land as to whether there's something that's suitable for this sort of thing. But then again, is it serviced, is it not serviced? Those sorts of things that need to be considered.
Municipally serviced or privately serviced?
No, city services, right? So you need to, we need to have that conversation down the road. I don't think we're at that point yet, because I don't think we know, I can't say to staff, pinpoint a piece of property that you think this is going to work, because I don't think we're at that point yet. But that's not something that we probably could have a conversation with down the road and see if there is anything. And if there is nothing, then so be it. But it doesn't mean that we're just shutting the door right now. Got something to look at.
Could staff comment if there's been any private landholders that have come forward with any willingness for this?
Through your worship, staff have received one temporary use permit application. We are currently working with that owner to further define what use they are intending to seek. This is the challenge that we're running into. Whether or not, the city allows for a temporary use permit on a campground for stays of up to 6 months. That's certainly something that can be done. Or if we look at examining our campground regulations, just make that an automatic for properties that are zoned to allow campgrounds. With the applications that we have received thus far, we are seeing proposals to allow for RVs year-round accommodation, which is not something that we have the authority to issue.
Okay, thanks. Would it be worth having this applicant come and give a delegation to council?
Sorry?
Would it be worth this applicant coming to council and give a delegation of their plans so that everybody here gets a quick look at it?
Comment, Mr. Simon, on that?
Through your worship, if that's direction that comes from council, staff could certainly reach out to the applicant to see if they were interested in giving a presentation. You know, at the point that their temporary use permit application is ready to be presented to council, they would also have the opportunity, if council deemed it appropriate, to discuss it at that time.
Thanks, Paul.
Any other comments, questions from council? Council Lucian.
Thanks, Mayor Schulz. I was just wondering, like going back to people living in RVs considered campers, would there be the opportunity to open up any city land, obviously not right now, and lease it to the emergency shelter program for them to run as a campground?
Comment, Mr. Simon or Mr. Black regarding that, and so I'm just going to, before you answer that question, I'm just going to go back to what I stated earlier. There would have to be a piece of property in my mind that would either have a facility on it for water sewer or be plumbed in where someone can hook up their stuff. That's kind of what we would be, if you're going to have somebody come cruising in there because they're living in their tiny car and have been moved out of their home and living in their car or their van or whatever the case may be, they need to be able to have facilities to utilize and have to have some safe place to get water, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So those are things that come to mind. Now, Mr. Parliament.
Well, I'll chime in, give Mr. Simon a quick little break. This is a question that's being asked over and over to Councilor Lucia's question, which is city-owned land. Roughly, there are 75 parcels that the city owns. Roughly, there are 26 parcels of which facilities sit on. 25 parcels which are undevelopable. They've got steep slope, they've got utility challenges, Mother Nature, and roughly 23, 24 parcels that are being vetted by staff to determine whether or not they're deemed surplus, and those surplus lands would be forwarded to council for consideration to enter into a partnership with a non-for-profit or another stakeholder to achieve our affordable housing goals or be created in terms of a campground, etc. So those are the numbers that we are working on. I know Paul and his staff have been going around internally asking the fire chief, asking recreation, asking engineering of these 25 parcels, which lands do you deem surplus that do not need any use from the city in the near future, and can we release it to council to consider releasing it to another partner to build housing or entertain a campground proposal, etc. I believe that's still being done internally, and we expect to release those parcels soon. Anything you want to add to that, Paul?
Through your worship, nope. Once we have kind of that inventory finalized, at council's discretion, if they want to authorize someone undertaking a use, they could apply through the city for necessary permits. In that case, it would probably be a temporary use permit for a campground. Staff will do the review, bring the file forward for council consideration, and away we go.
That answer your question, Council?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Any other questions or concerns regarding the non-traditional residential accommodation? Seeing no further questions, thank you, Mr. Simon. Let's move on. We're going to move on to development approvals procedure bylaw. So do you have presentation, or Ms. Henderson's going to do presentation?
Yes, through your worship. We have Ms. Henderson here, who's a senior local government advisor with Urban Systems. She has worked with us on many different items over the last few years now. We're very lucky to have her supporting us, as we have a lot of work to do in the Planning and Development Services group. And I believe previous council members will certainly be familiar with Ms. Henderson, but I will pass it over to her to give a brief introduction and then jump into the presentation.
Thank you, Paul, and good afternoon, Your Worship and members of council. I'm also here with my colleague, Ellen Miles, who you'll see on the screen as well. And Ellen is supporting with this project on the procedures bylaw and some of the other initiatives that we're working on. So did want to introduce you to Ellen as well. And I'm just going to share my screen as I do have a presentation for you. You received a copy in your report, I believe, and this one has a few modifications, but for the most part is fairly consistent. So let's get that going there. And so the presentation today, there's I know there's a lot of change on council since the last time that I was before you, and yeah, congratulations on your new role. So I will also provide an update on the process. I'll go through it quite quickly, and I'll provide an opportunity also for questions before we get into the workshop on the development application procedures bylaw review. So we'll go through it. I know you have a report and the presentation in advance of this, because really the purpose of today is to hear from you and to hear your thoughts to help guide the development of this bylaw. But I'll provide some context and then be handing it over to the floor to add some potential input into the bylaw on each of these subject areas. So just moving forward with a bit of the overview, as council's aware, and I know Revelstoke is feeling this quite strongly, is this housing crisis that's dealing with much of the country, and especially in communities like Revelstoke, is really the foundation of this initiative and this funding program by the province. And a lot of pressure is on municipalities to speed up their process, thinking that if supplies in the marketplace sooner, it will help solve the housing crisis. And developers are often commenting, time is money. So the longer the process takes, the more expensive housing gets as well. The provincial government conducted a provincial level development application procedures review that was completed in 2019. And basically identified, several, I think there's hundreds of recommendations, but some of the sort of larger issues that they found is that municipalities across the province were dealing with poor quality and incomplete applications by many applicants, and that was really slowing down the process. And they take a lot more time, staff resources to process and get through to approval than really well put together applications. So there's a big focus on improving application content and a number of initiatives regarding pre-application meetings, but as well as this real clear documentation on what's expected. There's also a lot of inconsistency in many municipalities with regulations and policies. So staff take a while to sort of actually interpret what's actually needed, and different departments sometimes have different expectations. So there's a lack of clarity. And over time, from even the last 30, 40 years, the complexity, you just look at climate change and how that's affecting things, but the complexity and the layers of development applications have gotten a lot more diverse, and the requirements have increased. And then just in terms of lack of or contradictory comments from different departments. So one department will say this, another department will say that, and then navigating that through the process is something that happens quite regularly. But there's certain recommendations in the report that we've made to stop that or alleviate that from most situations. And then the development communities also expressed that they would really love to see more transparency in terms of like where the status of applications are at, as well as consistency between adjacent local governments, which is quite interesting because it's something where, local governments have that autonomy and see themselves different than others, but especially when you're working in places like the Central Okanagan or Metro Vancouver, you're crossing jurisdictions, and it's the same consultants working in each, so it can get quite confusing when you've got a lot of bylaws to learn and understand. There's also been some legislative changes subsequent to the provincial report, referred to often as Bill 26. But the two key legislative changes that we'll be discussing today are the change to the default requirement to hold public hearings when a zoning application is consistent with the OCP. You no longer require a public hearing. So we're going to talk about that and maybe some of the other options and considerations that council may wish to reach out to the community for other forms of engagement as part of the workshop. And also the delegation of development variance permits. There's new legislation that allows council to delegate minor development variance permit approvals to staff. There's some requirements associated with that as in terms of establishing criteria for determining what is minor and guidelines for making those decisions. And that's something that we have before council as a decision point today is council's interest in utilizing this new delegation opportunity to streamline application processing. The development approvals process modernization project that council's referred to a couple times already this evening is a 100% funded opportunity from the province through UBCM. Revelstoke was extremely successful with this grant with $398,000 and change awarded to the city for this project. The maximum funding amount was $500,000 and many smaller communities received much less money. So Revelstoke did very well on this application. And the purpose of it is really to improve efficiency, remove red tape, as often said, and just ease the development approval process. And clear levels of service is something that's also sought. We did develop the summary report, which was attached to your report. And the sort of 5 key short-term items are all grant fundable, and they're outlined in the report. And on this slide just sort of summarizes them. But the internal procedures and processes is something that we're also working with staff on. Is essentially like having a standardized process and checklist that can help onboard new staff and also make sure that no matter who's sitting in a chair, no matter which planner is dealing with an application, it's being processed in the same way. And it's very clear so that steps aren't missed. So we're working on that as well as templates and checklists so that you're writing letters to applicants that are quite similar for certain applications and making templates so that you're not necessarily having to recreate the wheel, making it as easy as possible for staff. We've also identified, and one thing that we've noticed in the city of Revelstoke, probably more so than some of our other clients, is a lot of the reason for the time that it's taking to process applications is the state of the current bylaws. They're very complex. They're also missing quite a lot of information, and it's quite hard to interpret the bylaws in general, like from a comparative review perspective. So there's quite a lot of recommendations to improve those bylaws, and the development application procedures bylaw is one of those. There's also lots of opportunities to help, with on the development applicant side of the table, with the addition of additional guides and clearer application forms, more technical bulletins and information, as well as like improving the relationship and continuing to reach out and provide this information and opportunities for input and feedback from the development community. And we've also got GIS and software improvements and looking for opportunities to find technological solutions. We're doing a lot of work as well with the city on improving the GIS and just making sure that that information is accurate and reliable, and it could really speed up decisions when staff are doing their review, as well as providing open data as the goal to provide applicants and their consultants so that things can move faster. That's a very significant part of the budget. And then development finance is something that we did a presentation with the previous council regarding, opportunities to fund infrastructure to facilitate growth and some of the options with that, including, development cost charges and other opportunities there to fund the needed growth that's been identified. And then we submitted this summary report and took it to council last fall. There was a resolution that's included on the screen and in your report from council to move forward with these implementation steps that have been identified. And the development approvals procedures bylaw and delegation bylaw is the number one there. And that's really what we're here to discuss today. And so this project is being done in a number of phases. Really, phase one is complete. Phase 2 and 3 are happening right now simultaneously, and phase 4 is probably a couple weeks behind. So, we're moving very quickly to get all of this done by the terms of the grant is to have this complete by August 15th. And I believe we're on schedule to do that. But it is a significant effort that sort of needs to be working together with staff, and staff have been extremely supportive of, and I've also put a lot of in-kind effort into this project as well. And this really just, kind of states out the phasing, which, as I've mentioned, there's some overlap in the phases and that they're happening at the same time. But this particular workshop is really a phase 2 item. So before I go into the sort of workshop where we're going to be talking about the components of the bylaw and areas where we are hoping for some input from council, does anyone have any questions that they'd like to address before moving into sort of the details?
Any comments, questions, council? Seeing none, Nancy, go ahead.
Perfect. All right, so in the summary report, we identified, numerous changes so that we'd be looking at essentially a repeal and replace of the existing development approval procedures bylaw and bringing in the delegation items that council is supportive of into this bylaw as well. So the development approval information is in some municipalities have these as a separate bylaw. You have to identify in your official community plan that development approval information is required. And we would recommend consolidating this into the development approval procedures bylaw as well as the delegation provisions as noted, respecting only development applications. So these bylaws typically include the processing procedures. That's one thing the existing bylaw does not do very comprehensively, as well as the information that's required. There's opportunities to rely on like professional reliance in terms of reports. This is very operational, as you can tell. But then there's this public engagement beyond the public hearing requirements that council generally really wants to provide direction on into how the community is engaged in certain types of applications. And we'll be asking for your input there, including some notification requirements that may be over and above the Local Government Act requirements. When it's a Local Government Act requirement, there's no real discussion, but some municipalities send notification over and above legislation. As well as the municipality has the ability to collect security for landscaping and environmental works, as well as like just basically performance security. So those types of things are included in the bylaw and again are quite operational. So there's not a lot of discussion there, but of course council will have the opportunity to review the bylaw when it comes back to you for readings. And then the delegated authority, which is something that we're really have a lot of questions for council to consider tonight. So I've included throughout the presentation some of the legislation. I won't get into the detail, but it's there for your reference in terms of where in the Local Government Act this authority comes from and what's expected. This just sort of shows you the scope of what is in the development approval procedures bylaw. So there's quite a bit in there, but the most part is really each of the different types of applications and the process and procedures for each. So public hearings is one that we'll dive into, provide a bit of an overview, and then look at some of the other community engagement opportunities. But this is one where there's a significant change in the Local Government Act. Council before had the ability to waive a public hearing requirement, but not many councils actually did do that on a regular basis. They tend to just go through the process and have that public hearing. If you think about it, the public hearings generally it's between first and third reading of the bylaw. The bylaws are already set. The applicant has spent in many cases hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then you're going to the community and asking what they think. It's quite late in the process. So, I think there's been some thinking of how can we do this better? And one is if you spend a lot of time on public engagement with your OCP, and you include, you're concluding the visioning and community engagement at that time. So there's been the opportunity for the members of the municipality to kind of provide their input. And you're in alignment with that, like maybe just move forward with zoning more quickly. So, that option is now in place for sure. And then there's maybe some other things that council might want to consider in terms of encouraging public engagement earlier in the process before first reading. So this is kind of what it looks like. This is included in the summary report as well. So when a zoning application does not conform with the OCP, in other words, an OCP amendment is required, the process hasn't changed. Public hearings are still required. However, if the zoning is in alignment in general conformity with the OCP, then what municipalities need to do is send notification prior to first reading, saying that you're considering this bylaw, and that would give the community an opportunity to provide input to council before first reading at a minimum. So that is the new process that's been established by the province. So, there's basically no longer that default requirement. There's no need to waive. Essentially, there's some other options that council can look at if that makes you feel uncomfortable or in certain situations. Some municipalities are encouraging public information meetings so that they're essentially saying, hey, we recommend the developer does a public information meeting and they leave it up to them and that they're going out to the community. And other municipalities are requiring them, or they may say they may require for larger, more significant applications. But if something's quite minor, they could just say, you know what, in this case, it's quite minor and it's aligned with the OCP and the community is expecting this. There's no need for a public information meeting. So you could write the bylaw with some flexibility. Notification mail outs as well, like in addition, like for the public information meeting is quite commonplace as well. And you could also look at signs to identify certain development applications so that people see that something's going on there. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the options and some of the drawbacks, particularly in snow country, but another consideration for council. So the existing practices is, there's notices of application that are being sent out, 100-meter radius for OCP, zoning bylaw, and variances in the current bylaw. Temporary use permit applications are also sent out. It's not included in the bylaw at this time, but it's included in your sort of existing practices and the guide. And right now, Revelstoke does not require application signs by bylaw. And public information meetings are also not required by bylaw at this time either. So, these would be new things if council is interested in them, but I will provide some explanation as what they could look like, and then opportunities for council to provide input. So notice of application signs, for the municipalities that are interested, they're looking at notice of application signs generally for OCP zoning amendments and temporary use permit applications only. Some municipalities do have them for variances as well. The signs are trending towards being more colorful information signs with graphics. They might, even show, some of the proposed development, kind of like, look what's happening in your neighborhood type things versus they used to be very technical. And they're certainly not recommended for development permit applications because they're non-discretionary. And we'll talk more about that as we go. It would, if council did want to do this, we foresee like 2 or 3 branded sign template options, and then it would be up to sort of fill in the blanks on those signs. The onus for construction and posting is on the applicant. And so to sort of mitigate staff's involvement, they would generally proof the sign. But signs can be challenging in snow country. So just like one consideration there. But you wouldn't be the first snow country location that does have signs. This is a new template that's under consideration right now in Grand Forks, but just kind of showing what they could look like. And they basically are providing opportunities for people to find additional information and to see that something is happening around them. So is council interested in incorporating notice of application signs for, major OCP and zoning bylaw amendments or temporary use permit applications? Or is it something that you think that the community's has a pretty good idea what's going on when it comes to development right now, and it's unnecessary? Your input would just be really informative to the development of the bylaw.
So Ms. Henderson, if I can, I want to speak to this just briefly. We're seeing, if we go outside our community into the CSRD area, we're seeing signs up, and for me, even though I sit on the CSRD board, I may not be cognizant of the fact that there's some sort of application in the works, and seeing these signs up tells me where it is and gives me an idea that something's happening in that neighborhood. So I think this sort of thing would be just another good way. We talk about communication or lack of communication sometimes within our own realm. And this is just another way of saying to the community, something's happening in your neighborhood. Here's the signage. And it gives, in my mind, it would give the community in that neighborhood a chance to go, hey, what's happening on Joe's property? It's been vacant for the last 50 years. And now all of a sudden something's going to happen. Oh my God. And so it kind of, if there's some idea on the sign as to what's going to happen, and then at that point, that community member can engage with the planning department or the proponent or whatever the case may be to kind of look at that. But that's just a personal feeling from me. I think it would be a positive moving forward. Is it going to be required on everything? No, probably not. But on some things that may have implications in the development of that area of the community, it might be advantageous. So any other comments from councillors? Councillor Cherry.
I'd like to agree with you. I'm excited and happy that we're starting to move the public engagement to the forefront of the process. And I think this is another way to do that. Okay. So I'd be interested.
Any other comments from council? Councillor Orlando.
Yeah, Your Worship, I am in support of the signs question. I'm including them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. So I'm going to assume that that everyone around the table would feel comfortable with this, or you wouldn't be adverse to that. Is that correct? Yes. Yeah. So I think having signs, Ms. Henderson, Councillor Palmer, would you like to weigh in, please?
Yeah, I'm very supportive of it's better communications with the public. I think the public has been asking for better knowledge rather than the last minute kind of third reading OCP or public hearing kind of process, which feels very stilted and doesn't provide feedback on a timely basis to the developers. So I'm supportive.
Great, thanks for the comment. All right, Ms. Henderson, everyone around the table is supportive of that.
Okay, thank you for that. That helps greatly. The next item is the public information meetings. So these are typically on the onus is put on the developer to host and pay for. Many municipalities do a mail out similar to a public hearing and would take responsibility for that because of freedom of information, having the information and just making sure that notice is adequately provided, even though there's no legislative requirement. They would allow for early engagement. So the recommendations, say for a zoning application that is in conformance with the OCP, would be that these public information meetings happen in advance of a formal notification of first reading, with the idea that the applicant is taking some input from the community and potentially having the opportunity to address those issues before, and they want to revise their application to do that. They generally are more informal. I mean, they could be virtual. They could be during COVID, many municipalities were hosting them virtually. They could be in a community center. And, you know, they do, you may wish to include in the bylaw the use of may require versus must, because some application situations, you know, again, it's such a minimal change. But these are other avenues to seek early engagement. This particular quote is from Bill Buhlhauser, who's a leading expert in planning law, essentially wrote the book on it, and is also is a teacher at the School of Urban and Regional Planning at UBC. But, you know, this was before the changes in the public hearing legislation, but, you know, certainly sees public information meetings as a best practice because it's a much more timely period to provide public feedback. And so what does council think about the ability to encourage or require public information meetings for certain applications? You kind of leaning towards like OCP amendments and major rezonings. And again, development permits should not be subject to public information meetings as they're non-discretionary. Some municipalities have got in trouble with that. So generally they would take place at the OCP amendment and possibly a rezoning level. So over to you, council.
So I'm going to be supportive of this too, Ms. Henderson, because I've been part of public information meetings. It gives the proponent a chance to basically give the information firsthand to the community and those that are going to be around, whatever that development is or rezoning application. It kind of stops any rumors, it gives facts out. And it also gives a chance for those in the community to weigh in as to their concerns. You know, I've been in public information meetings where rumors have got around, and before people even start to look at the boards in the meetings, they're chewing me a new one, and it gives them the opportunity to actually speak their mind. I'm okay with that in a public information meeting, because then we can walk over to the board and say, well, what you're saying is really not factual. Here's the facts, and they get to see firsthand. And I think the benefit for the proponent and even for the city to, again, get that information out firsthand is a positive thing. That's from my perspective. Councillor Lustro, you have a comment?
Yes, thanks, Mayor Schultz. I just have a question. These public information meetings, would those be replacing the public hearings for big changes to OCP and rezoning, or is this in addition to those?
Comment, Ms. Henderson?
Yeah, if an OCP amendment is required, it requires a public hearing, so it would be in addition to. If it's a zoning in alignment with the public hearing, it would be probably recommended replacement of, but council has the opportunity to opt into public hearings at first reading. So what would happen with a zoning amendment that was in alignment with the OCP is, let's just say there's the application comes in, there's some staff internal processes, they'd have their public information meeting once I think staff was relatively satisfied where it's at. They may want to revise after that public information meeting. Then there's a requirement to send notice in accordance to the Local Government Act. So there's no option there to property owners or within 100, well, you set the distance, but 100 meters, let's say around the application. And the community is still very concerned and comes out, and then council's looking at first reading. You have the ability at that time to opt in to a public hearing, and then a public hearing would be required. But if you're feeling pretty confident as to the direction of the application, it's in conformance with the OCP, you could sail right through. Generally, municipalities would be giving up to 3 readings and then dealing with any conditions to the application and then moving forward to the 4th reading for approval.
Your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Any other comments or questions from council? Seeing none, so I guess we're supportive of this public information on most of these applications, Ms. Henderson.
Great, thank you.
Let's move on. Thanks.
Okay, the next items are regarding delegation to staff. So delegation's been identified as an opportunity to streamline the process. There's often sort of a 4-week to 2-month time savings by through delegation. There's less administrative burden. There's generally a lighter memo presented to the delegate. They're usually the director or manager of planning. And yeah, they just tend to move through because it's also less burden on preparing council reports and on council agendas. It's encouraged in the provincial DAPA report. I've cut and pasted the recommendation from the provincial report into this slide. But it is important to establish the comfort level of the local government regarding delegation powers. And, they can be expanded and retracted by bylaw amendment. So similar to what you'll be seeing with this, it's an administrative bylaw. So it essentially can have 3 readings of council, 24 hours, and then adoption. But it is a bylaw amendment to change. So what we want to do is just kind of talk about the different aspects of delegation and also give council the opportunity to provide input here. We will provide sort of existing delegation powers as well as a refresher, as well as some other examples of other municipalities. So delegation, again, it must be done by bylaw. Except for public hearings can also be delegated. It doesn't happen very much, but that would just be by resolution. You can delegate development permits, heritage alteration permits, minor development variance permits, which is new. And you're also, if, say, for example, the delegate denies an application, the applicant, should they wish, are entitled for reconsideration by council. And basically, you can delegate the issuance of TUPs, DVPs, development variance permits, and DPs subject to conditions established by council. That's very common. And then the requirement for development approval information, for example, that's generally standard across the province. So development permits are non-discretionary. That's something that is important to understand. Both the city and the applicant are bound to the guidelines that have been established. In Revelstoke's case, they're included in the official community plan. So the applicant must follow them and the city must follow them. You can't add to them after the fact. So if you don't like what's being approved, then basically council has to direct staff to bring forward amendments to the official community plan that would amend those guidelines. Providing notice or hosting public information meetings may create a legitimate expectations that notices will always be provided, and also create an impression that council has the discretion to refuse to issue the permit. So that is a very difficult political situation. So it's just generally not recommended to bring the public in to specific applications. However, very important at time of creating those development permit guidelines to have public engagement. And courts have ordered municipalities to issue development permits if they've taken into consideration to matters not within the OCP guidelines. And I've included some case law there from White Rock. If you want to Google it, it's usually a pretty interesting read. The existing development, the existing delegation for development permits, existing scope, our minor development permits are delegated to staff, and they're currently defined as projects with construction value of less than 100,000, which is really not much in today's dollars. Minor signage, facade improvements, and screening and recycling bins. So I would say on a scale of 1 to 10 around the province in terms of DP delegation, currently the city's at about a 1. There's much greater delegation out there. So for example, most municipalities delegate technical DPs to staff, which are environmental DPs, hazard, wildfire, agriculture. Those types of DPs generally are delegated to staff in most municipalities. Fernie, New Westminster, and Vernon delegate all development permits to staff, everything. Summerlin has just made a change, so all multifamily up to 3 stories and floor area up to 1,500 square meters, so about 15,000 square feet, and mixed use up to 3 stories. Penticton is up to 6 stories and even higher square meters. Kamloops also has delegation for multifamily under 8 units and DPs at the university not fronting McGill Road. So just kind of giving you a spectrum. It's really up to where council is comfortable, but the trend is certainly more delegation to staff for sure for development permits. So at a minimum, our recommendation would be that council would consider infill development and technical DPs, that they are delegated. Council may also wish to consider delegation of multifamily, commercial, and industrial form and character development permits. You might want to look, some municipalities want to look, say, outside of a specific area like downtown. Everything's delegated outside an area. It could be by geography as well. Is it height, that council would be more concerned about, floor area, and then infill housing, there's a discussion earlier is like gentle density. When carriage houses came out, many municipalities required development permits. Now many of them are streamlining them so that there's no development permits. But if you have a small infill or gentle density type plex development that the city is interested in, you may wish to have development permit guidelines, but you could delegate them to speed them up. It would be typical to say that delegation of DPs with only minor variances, like to limit variances to DPs to minor. So yeah, that just kind of provides some recommendations and thoughts for council, and we certainly are looking for some direction to help us scope this bylaw to bring back to you for further consideration. So any input would be greatly appreciated.
Comments, council? I think when I look at it, recommending all the minor DPs, technical DPs should be delegated to staff. Delegation of multifamily, commercial, industrial outside of downtown. The staff kind of know what the community wants and that sort of thing, so I don't have a problem with that. Multiple housing or multiple families. I guess the only thing I get concerned about is height. What are we going to do with that infill housing? Look at that sort of thing. I think if we said to staff, yeah, look after infill housing, but you want something that's going to fit into that. You don't want this oddball, in my mind, looking building within infill between 2 heritage houses, that sort of thing. So, I'm asking for you to weigh in as to what you feel you would, we can kind of go through that and then just give Ms. Henderson some thought. Any comments?
I got a question. Outside of delegating the staff, are we able to also delegate this to some of our committees and commissions? You did mention the heritage or the APC as well.
Okay, Ms. Henderson, any thought on that sort of thing?
The committees,
input?
yeah, through your worship, yeah, the committees are there to provide advice to council and not make decisions. So this would be delegated to staff and generally, familiar with the policy and professional advice. I mean, you can certainly staff. It can be part of the process that they're referring to those committees to support their delegated authority. So those committees could still be part of the process if council wishes.
I think should be a requirement.
Okay, appreciate that. Councilor Luchau, you have a comment?
No.
Councilor Orlando.
Yeah, your worship, thank you. Other than minor amendments, technical DPs, beyond that, at this point, I'm not supportive of adding delegation additional delegation powers to staff. And my rationale is that when I was on council last time, we did include a delegation bylaw for minor, it was up on the screen there, for under $100,000. And I feel that in some instances that's gone wrong, badly wrong. And upset a lot of people. So for me, it's a trust level issue, and I'm not there yet right now for, when I see multifamily developments that, that could be technically a really big project. We could have a 500 unit thing, technically multifamily. Again, same thing, commercial or other industrial forms. And this just is born out of experience. I was enthusiastic for the initial delegation bylaw, but my feeling is that it was highly problematic, and I'm just not there to come around to this now.
Okay, thanks for that comment. Any other comments from council? Councillor Palmer, do you have a comment?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Sulz. Yeah, it's an interesting sort of dilemma on the delegation. So, assuming everything is functioning really well and sort of minimal controversy from an efficiency perspective from council, you'd want to delegate everything you possibly could. Maybe to the point you don't need councils anymore. But certainly in big communities, there's a practicality. So obviously places like Vancouver and big communities need much more robust delegation to staff. Of course, they have more resources and checks and balances there. I'm a little bit in the realm where Councillor Orlando is as well. Over the years, and perhaps decades, the delegation bylaw for Revelstoke is sort of gone up and down a little bit and changes to bylaws. Yet it can be pretty tedious. So I'm sort of weighing out these two things. It can be pretty tedious if we get really minor things that say, okay, why are we dealing with this? But then as soon as something gets triggered and it's controversial, our community is expecting council to be actively involved in helping steer where we go. So there's that little bit of a dilemma. I would suggest that if it's feasible, and I know we're on tight timelines to get this work all done, but maybe just saying, okay, well, this is the threshold where we are today. Here's an incremental threshold where we could perhaps increase the delegation. In whether that happens right away or later on, I think that might be one approach. It's until we actually get into the nitty gritty details and as to what's the implications, then it's really hard to understand, to foresee what the controversy that could be with delegation. So I'm not necessarily too helpful there, but just hopefully it does help a little bit anyway. Thanks.
Any further comment from council, Mr. Black?
Thank you, Your Worship. I believe that the intent here is that we're just trying to streamline process, and so the idea is that it's very minor. Staff should have the opportunity to weigh in on this. In the example of housing projects, we saw what CP did without having the input of the local community by building a structure in 6 months and having it occupied. It's just simply pushing these things forward where there is very little opportunity for controversy. And so that's the goal, I believe, behind this, and to also streamline your processes so that you're not dealing with things that, in my mind, could be or should be delegated to staff. Thank you.
Good. Appreciate that. Mr. Simon?
Through your worship, thank you. I don't want to barge too much on the council discussion. Just want to provide some feedback from staff administering the current delegation bylaw and some of the challenges that we have. So over the last 3 years that I've been here, we've only had one development permit that's been brought to council. And it was actually an amendment to a development permit where council had, I guess, changed what the staff recommendation was. So there's been that level of consistency in my experience here for council and staff certainly being on the same page and not making any different decision than what staff would have made. One of the big challenges that we do have right now that I will be certainly pushing for as a change to this bylaw is that $100,000 limit. That creates a major administrative challenge to actually quantify on these projects. And it also opens up the opportunity for applicants as they're coming through where their projects, they're intentionally trying as hard as they can to get under that $100,000 threshold to make it a minor development permit. So at the very least, something I would like to help frame this discussion with council is not thinking about it in dollar value, because that becomes very challenging to administer. And is that just construction costs? Does it include labor costs? There's all these questions that arise, and it certainly creates logistical challenges for staff. So with the discussion today, if there's anything that council can provide us that would help frame that in the context of something that is a little bit more black and white, that doesn't have as much ambiguity as the current delegation bylaw has. So if there's, certain projects that are under a certain number of stories, certain number of building height, that would be really, really helpful for us today.
Okay, any comments from council? So, when I think of that, we've been talking about this for the last couple of years, I think, Mr. Simon, regarding that $100,000 threshold. And as all these dollar values go up, it goes like almost a garage is over $100,000 now too. And then it comes to council, we're going like, why is this coming to us? And, some of those little things. So if we take out the dollar value, how would we streamline this from what we call minor and major, that sort of thing? So those are questions that I have for that, trying to make it as easy for your staff as possible and still give council the feeling that when we have some major things like, some of the commercial stuff that we've seen or temporary stuff that's gone up and that's been controversial over the last couple of years, and you look at it and say, okay, how do we mitigate that? In my mind, that sort of stuff should be coming to council. It should be on council, not on staff. And then we wear that, but also we're representing our community. Not that you aren't, but it just changes the focal point as to who's going to wear this sort of thing. And so I'm just asking kind of from your perspective as to what you feel would be advantageous to you so that we as council can kind of discuss that. And maybe I'm not, kind of getting down to the meat and potatoes of things, but I look at it and go, I want to make things as streamlined for the community as possible, but also want the council or the community to know that, yes, council's going to wear this. If there's some unusual things that are coming forward, it's going to come to council. But we're all on the same page so that, staff are not wearing some of the decisions that might be controversial, but also by the same token, we're not standing in the proponent's way as we move forward. So any comment?
To your worship, and Ms. Henderson may have something to certainly add on to this. I would much rather see something where it's residential development over X amount of units needs to go to council. Commercial industrial development over X amount of square meters needs to go to council, having very specific parameters in the bylaw so that staff have that direction with something that's tangible rather than a construction value that can certainly be open to interpretation and certainly be something that the development industry can try and meander around. And one of the other issues with the construction value is when projects are done in phases, the value of construction is lesser per phase, and an applicant may choose to do something through 3 separate development permits, all under $100,000, rather than through one major development permit. So this would certainly get around that, and Ms. Henderson may have something to add on to that.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Henderson.
Yeah, Your Worship, I think one thing that council should really consider is, where in your view is the risk? Because council is bound to the development permit guidelines, as would staff be, and as the applicant is. So if you're ending up with products that you're not happy with, you need to look at revising your development permit guidelines. And what would probably be a helpful exercise is if those are situations, like, then how could we clarify the guidelines so that you could entrust staff, delegating staff to determine, if an application meets those guidelines. That would be maybe a goal. I mean, I know it was identified that this can be incremental. Perhaps, there's a certain comfort level that we can reach. And then maybe we need to be looking at identifying what those DP guidelines are that need to change, because council can't take in the public's considerations in the development permit process, because you're bound to the guidelines as well. So I think that's something to keep at the back of your mind. But yes, I think in terms of while those guidelines are getting tightened up so that everybody can rely on them. Yes, I would agree that a square meter, you saw those other communities utilizing like 1,500 square meters or 2,300 square meters or height under, 3 stories. But if your guidelines aren't strong and you feel that you could have a building that doesn't meet your expectations, if it's under 3 stories, is it okay? But anyway, those are things to consider. But yes, I would move away from a dollar value.
Okay. So having heard that, council, any comments from any of you?
I got a comment.
Please.
Overall, I'm supportive of this. I would like to see that we get the proper checks and balances in before we were to dive straight into it. For example, multifamily over a certain height or number. Looking at the previous page, I can see from construction background, Penticton, allowing multifamilies up to 6 stories. That's done in the fact with the ability to use non-combustible, so you're allowed to use wood frame buildings up to that size. Vastly different city than us. I don't think we are allowed to build 6 stories right now. Just something to consider. I would like to hear Aaron explain some of the potential failures to think on the last time we did this, just so we have an example that we all know
of. I think that in the past several years, not necessarily related to development permits, but there's been several highly controversial developments where the neighbors express a lot of, or business before council, where community members express a lot of concern. And my sort of contention is that I want community members to feel like they're being listened to. I feel when this works and goes well, whatever the development is, and we can have reasonable dialogue, which it is incumbent upon the city to foster. It does not happen naturally. It's up to us to make sure we have a system in place to do that. Then we have good dialogue and people are generally reasonable about stuff. I think that the concern is when something goes through on things that have gone through on delegation have been concerning. I think the $100,000 threshold is an interesting, observations that Mr. Simon is making there. I think, to the comment that Councillor Palmer made, maybe we can keep going, I'm exaggerating here, but keep going and say, why do we need a council? Is it just up, it should be up to the development services staff, because we do wear that, when these things go south, we do, as a political body, wear that. And so, to summarize, where I'm trying to get, especially with communications, is to communicate separate communications work unrelated to what's before us at hand, is just get us to a point where people are better informed. So I think, for example, signage is an interesting one. We've had a development application recently that was before council, and I think what people notice is the sign, and that's what I hear. They're not finding out other ways through ourselves. So anyways, long story short, I feel that some delegation decisions have been problematic, and as the person who was on council at the time approved that, I wear that, and I've heard that deep criticism from community members, so I'm leery at this point, and I need to build a level of trust before I'm happy going forward anymore. Other than the minor positions there. And it's also my understanding that the consultant will present policy suggestions on this following gathering input from council here. So if we're looking at it at a more line item basis in the future, line by line through the policy, then I'm happy to explore that, but I'm not in a position right now to make suggestions of how many square feet or how many stories or what it should be. I just don't have the background of that.
Thanks.
Any other comments from council? Ms. Henderson, are we giving you a sense of anything, with all due respect, as to which direction to move forward? You know, I'm feeling that we're in the same place we were before we started the conversation, and just kind of, you know, feeling that maybe you might have a little more recommendations. I kind of look at it, I mean, I can give you my personal feeling. I know that we've seen some things that have gone to, that were put in place, and Mr. Simon, I'm going to say Victoria Road, you know, that was a very controversial thing, and I'm not sure whether that was just delegated or not, I don't recall, but whatever, those sorts of things are the type of things that should be coming to council, so that, you know, we listen to the community, and that's kind of, you know, if I'm reading between the lines of what some of the other councilors are saying, those are some of the things that are concerning for us as we move forward. I also like to think that, you know, maybe we can change that dollar value to square footage and height, but I'm not sure. You know, I look at it now in our downtown core. I think it's we're at 3 stories or 3.5 stories or whatever. We're into meters, 15 meters or 12 meters or whatever. And then when we're out on the highway, it's a little higher, that sort of thing. So look at those sorts of things as sections of town. Maybe those are things that we can look at. So if I gave you that guidance, would that be helpful, Ms. Henderson, or am I just throwing out things that are going to just convolute the whole thing?
Your worship, thank you. I mean, council's very clarified, you know, the technical DPs as well, which weren't included in the existing bylaw. And I think that there's obviously some division on council, and we'll take that into consideration as we bring forward the bylaw, and we can draft a bylaw and also provide some options for council's consideration. And you could, you know, provide direction when you see those options in front of you. I think it would also probably be prudent for us to spend a little bit more time regarding the development permit guidelines. You know, council has brought up, you know, community concern several times, and unfortunately that community concern isn't going to alter council's decisions when you're making a decision on a development permit, because you're bound to the guidelines. But I think it's something to look at closely over the next year or so, because I think tightening up those guidelines to the point that council is happy to streamline and increase delegation over time, because it can be done incrementally as that trust is solidified as well. But I think we have a good understanding that there's a bit of division, and we'll tread carefully on this one before we bring it back to you.
All right, appreciate that. Thank you both.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, what's next?
Heritage alteration permits. So somewhat similar situation to DPs in terms of existing conditions. They were separated off in 1994 from development permit areas. There's very specific authority in the Local Government Act regarding heritage conservation areas. And similar to DPs, they have, you know, characteristics that would justify that designation. There are also guidelines in the OCP and how those objectives will be achieved. And there are exemptions, and HAPs may also be delegated to staff. And in some situations in Revelstoke, they currently are. And any approval or denial decisions must be consistent with the guidelines similar to development permits. So basically, those heritage alteration permits are required, subdivision, building, altering a property. They apply to both land and buildings. And they may require particular details over and above what can be applied through the development permit process. So it could be sort of more specific on building finishes and landscaping than a development permit can be. And you're required also, or you're authorized to require post-performance security to make sure that things are done in accordance with the permit, and that you can essentially use that security to satisfy a breach condition and additional funds as well, and then get that money back through property taxes, which is also sort of a unique power associated with HAPs. In terms of the official community plan, it does identify the heritage alteration permit area sort of in that area in yellow on the slide. There's a number of exemptions, such as interior renovations or additions or alterations that are not visible from the street level, basically changing the finishes, trim and windows as well. So essentially, we've kind of covered when it's required. If it's exempt, you wouldn't need a permit, but they do have particular details. Again, I mentioned just that you can ask for over and above a development permit. This is a repeat. And then heritage conservation areas seem to be going backwards. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. So again, it's all about process efficiency in terms of delegation. And the BC Building Code also provides alternative compliant methods for heritage buildings, which is another thing that sometimes are very difficult to meet code. Currently, permits for that have been delegated are for residential and commercial facades, minor residential additions, so less than 300 square feet, and minor commercial additions less than 300 as well. And is council interested to expand the scope of delegated heritage alteration permits at this time, or potentially increasing the size of the addition, or also include accessory buildings, for example?
I think I would be comfortable to definitely include accessory buildings. What we've seen in the past with our staff is heritage alteration and staff have indicated that it should look similar to the home or whatever, and it ended up being quite nice. So whether it was something that went through council or just through staff, I don't recall, Mr. Simon, some of the stuff, but I look at that and go, I think that's good. We have the heritage committee. I'm not sure, if you felt like you would like to put that through the Heritage Committee for their input, not for their decision-making, but for their input, and then be able to take that on. So I'm going to ask, is there council, are you willing to give some more leeway to staff when it comes to the heritage alteration permits?
Can we hear from staff on this one, how they feel?
Yeah. Mr. Simon, any comment? How do you feel about this?
Through your worship, I certainly feel less strongly about heritage permits than I do with the development permits. We don't receive a huge amount of heritage alteration permits. The current provisions in the delegation bylaw for heritage permits are a little bit more straightforward than the ones for development permits. And generally speaking, these heritage permits don't go, the minor ones, they don't go to our Heritage Commission for review. They would only be looking at the major ones. We have several buildings in the Heritage District that are in need of some work. So I think over the next several years, we are going to be seeing more and more of these permits come in. I would like to see a little bit more delegated authority provided to staff so that we can help expedite these permits getting through the process. And one of the things to be cognizant of as well is we did just update the OCP. So we do have some additional provisions in there to guide heritage management into the future. And Ms. Hartling is currently working and well underway with a heritage management plan that will ultimately result in some robust feedback and some potential revisions to our heritage conservation area design guidelines. So I do feel that the planning group is well equipped from a heritage perspective to take on more delegated authority, and that council in very short order is going to be able to help set that policy direction to guide subsequent staff evaluation of heritage alteration permits through that heritage management plan.
Thank you for that. Any other comments from council? Councilor Lano?
Yeah, your worship, I don't have as much concerns about heritage alteration permits, and I do like the suggestion of running it past the advisory committee for input.
All right, good. So Ms. Henderson, why don't you make some proposals to us with a bylaw and we can go from there.
Yes, Your Worship, that sounds good. Thank you. So moving on to variances, minor development variance permits, as noted previously, has been recently delegated by or recently allowed for the delegation to staff. It's very clear in the legislation that staff must be provided with criteria. So essentially is just defining what minor is and guidelines to consider when deciding to issue that variance. This is an example at sort of a very high level of what those criteria and guidelines could be that could be presented to you in the bylaw. One thing of note that we will also have a question for council and be asking for input is, interestingly, the Local Government Act for a council decision of a development variance permit requires notification. However, for a minor development variance permit that's been delegated to staff, notification to surrounding property owners is not required. Many of our clients are choosing to add provisions to their bylaw to send notification for minor development variances anyway. And then it would also, if the community is very concerned about that variance, it could also be rationale to no longer deem that application to be minor and to bring it up to council for a decision. And the way that the legislation is written regarding notification, you wouldn't have to resend notification. You could use that same notice. So there's some possibility there to consider. And also just, these guidelines are quite high level in terms of, is it sort of conformance with the general scope, or is there some physical or legal constraint, a right of way, for example, or slope, that sort of rationale for this variance? Is there a benefit, like an environmental benefit to moving the building, say, away from a river? And is like strict compliance with the zoning regulation unreasonable? And it wouldn't, in some looking at the neighborhood character and streetscape, then if it was creating an issue, it would be something that the delegate would just take into consideration and not support. Some municipalities are using percentages and being very, very specific in what's deemed minor and what's not. I think some would comment that, okay, if you say setbacks would be minor, anything less than 10%, is that just changing, the setback by reducing it by 10%, allowing it just to go to staff? So I like these general ones, but there's certainly an opportunity to add quite a lot of specific criteria that staff would take into consideration when looking at a variance. I know myself, having been in a staff position for over 20 years, there's been many situations where you've got a very small variance or a foundation poured in an incorrect location, where council themselves are saying, like, why is this coming to us? It's this sort of a waste of time and resources. So, I mean, there are some situations where variances are extremely minor. And so again, it's where council's comfort level is to determine the scope if you're open to delegating minor variance approval to staff. So that we do recommend, many municipalities across the province have already incorporated minor development variance permits that are delegated to staff in their bylaws. And what did you think about the criteria provided? I'm not sure if council's had a time to really contemplate it, but if there's any feedback on that, we'd really appreciate it. What else could we add, or what what are we missing? What should we be looking at? And is there anything specific that council really wants to see? That you don't want to delegate. If you could help us with that, it will probably make the process of bringing the bylaw before you and approved by you much more efficient. And then we'd also lastly like some input regarding the may require notification for MDVPs over and above the local government requirements. And the reason we would recommend the may require, but generally make it a standard practice, unless it's that 2-centimeter foundation that was poured in the incorrect location. That might be an exception where you don't want to send notices because it's arguably already done, and there's not a lot of benefit to it. But anyway, over to council for your feedback.
All right, so I'm going to weigh in again because I've sat here around this table wondering what the heck are we doing here. So there's some concerns in the community when a minor development variance permit, because somebody's poured a foundation in a wrong spot and it's out by 2 inches. Sorry, I'm metric, Ms. Henderson. I'm imperial, not metric. So we look at that sort of stuff and go, why is it coming in when council can deal with it? And there's some trepidation on the proponent's part, going like, now what's going to happen if council says, we got to move things. So you look at that and go like, okay. So I'm all in favor of, just delegating this to staff. Staff knows that if it's going to be a controversial thing, it's not a minor thing, and they'll deal with it in another way. So I'm quite content on your suggestions of just ruling that over into the minor development variance permits for staff to delegate. And that's just coming from my perspective and seeing those sorts of things over the last several years. Any comments from council? Councilor Devlin?
I'm inclined to agree with you. I do think that anything that would require notice to the community from us should probably require notice from staff as well. I don't like loopholes that would make it look like we're not communicating things that we would be required to communicate.
Yeah, and I like the words may require. And when we look at this small stuff where it's not going to make a difference if we're a few centimeters out and it's in the back alley or beside the lot or whatever. I don't think that's not a major concern. If there's something else that staff feel that we should let the neighbors know because people are going to be building or whatever, I think that's appropriate. Councilor Stapenhurst, did you have a question?
Oh, sir.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other comments from council? Seeing none, I'll leave that with you, Ms. Henderson.
Thank you. Okay, we're getting there, guys. The comprehensive development plans, it's already identified in your official community plan. Essentially areas where you don't have a lot of information on, an official community plan amendment is required, but this would be an area that hasn't been really studied for development. It has some development potential, but there might be a lot of constraints, environmental or infrastructure constraints, and a developer wants to move an application forward, but this city doesn't have its master plans in place for this area, for example, where you would essentially have the opportunity to say, well, we have a comprehensive development plan process, putting the onus on the developer should they wish to pull this information together at their cost. So like a neighborhood plan essentially done by a developer. And then they would come with a fairly significant fee would be our recommendation, because they would take quite a lot of staff time and resources to review. And it would also be an opportunity, if there wasn't the resources in-house, you would have some funds to potentially bring in a third party to assist staff. So really it's something that's in your OCP, but this would be establishing an application process for a comprehensive development plan. In Alberta, they're referred to as area structure plans. They're very common. They're often funded by the developer. And so we just wanted to kind of put this concept forward to council, include the opportunity to go down this route in the development application procedures bylaw. I would say in a community like Revelstoke, there might only be 1 to 5 areas that this would probably be applicable to. Sometimes it might be across multiple lots, and you would require property owners to work together, because it doesn't make sense to do an area without everybody being involved, and could also set the sort of framework. So how would this infrastructure extension be financed as well, could be part of it. A terms of reference would be required to sort of outline the requirements prior to application submission. And generally what we would recommend in this case is that the draft terms of reference be kind of worked on with staff and the applicant, but would have to go to council for approval. So council's involved really before a complete submission is any technical information is provided. And then you could also review the comprehensive development plan, deny, review, approve with conditions. And then once you've approved that comprehensive development plan, that would essentially set the foundation for the official community plan amendment, which would likely go through quite quickly if you're satisfied with it. But it puts a little more of a stronger process where the applicant is really funding those studies rather than the city. I think there's been some applications or some development areas in the city where the city's gone out and funded some of these infrastructure studies to facilitate that development. And in this case, it would be an opportunity to put that cost onto the applicant. So just wanted to see if council had any concerns or wanted to provide any direction or thoughts regarding providing a comprehensive development plan process within the bylaw.
Yeah, I'll go. I'm supportive of this as it moves forward. I think council's input will be there when it needs to be there. So I'm definitely supportive of this. I'll go around the table. Councilors, comment?
Yeah, absolutely supportive of it. Anything that takes costs and puts it on development and us is a win for us. Opinion. That's my opinion.
Any other comments?
Supportive.
Okay. So I think we're supportive of this, Ms. Henderson.
Right. Thank you. Okay, so that really concludes the workshop part of the presentation. I thank council very much for the feedback that you've provided today. It will greatly help the drafting of this bylaw, which we'll bring back to you. We wanted to also just touch base regarding our thoughts around development, industry, and community engagement with respect to this bylaw. Generally, my experience with development application or development approval procedures bylaws is there's not too much interest out there, but other than planners like ourselves. The development community, sometimes has some interest. Generally, if you're looking to alter fees, there's more interest. But what we're recommending is that we would draft the bylaw, provide an email update to the development community. We had many stakeholders involved in this process to provide them an update in general as to where this project is at and the good work that's being done by staff, and a copy of the bylaw for their review for an opportunity for them to provide some comments. That could be also have some web content and putting the draft bylaw on the website or Talk Revelstoke and a public information release, just so that we're being open and transparent regarding the preparation of this bylaw, and offer the opportunity or provide the opportunity for comments before bringing it back to council for first, second, and third reading. And just wanted to get council's thoughts on that, and if there's any concerns. The timeline that we kind of foresee here is getting this draft bylaw complete in the next few weeks. And then at that time, once staff is comfortable with it, it would still be in draft form, is to do that development, industry, and community engagement. Alternatively, we could take it to council and then finalize the bylaw, to a point where council's comfortable with it, and then do the engagement after readings and before adoption. So looking for some feedback there from council as well. But we hope to have this bylaw adopted by March, April, because we have other components of this project that are reliant on this information.
I personally feel engaging with the construction community as to this sort of thing prior to coming to council, so the council can hear their input. I think in my mind gives us a little better understanding of what they're feeling, and it's another way of engaging and us listening before we put this bylaw to rest. Any comments from council around the table?
Were you able to put this on talk Revelstoke as well before first and second, third reading as a draft?
Mr. Simon is nodding his head yes. Ms. Floyd's nodding her head yes.
Like
So
to get
yes.
some public feedback as well.
Okay. Okay. Councilor Orlando, did you have your hand up?
Oh, yeah, just a detail question. It was mentioned on the previous slide, a public information release. I'm hoping to get a bit more details on what the plan is for that, how that process works.
Comment, Ms. Henderson, on that?
Your worship, we would typically draft something for staff and then staff review and organizational review, and then you would do it in the normal course of action, whether that's providing it on your websites and make that public information release available, or potentially to the press as well.
That answer your question, Councilor, or is there input that you would like to give to that?
Your worship, I guess if I have any input, if with any big change, I'd like to see some effort put into marketing to make sure that people are aware of it. I'm sort of the mindset that, for example, putting it on the website doesn't reach a lot of people, and the more we can communicate ahead of time and let people know that changes are put, the better, in my opinion.
Okay, well, appreciate that input. Any other comments from council? Seeing none, thank you, Ms. Henderson.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Miles. I appreciate you being here. You're very quiet. Mr. Simon, thank you. So we have two more items on the docket here, but we're at 2.5 hours in. I just want to take a 5-minute break here, bio break for some of us who need it. And then we'll get back. Councilor Orlando.
Your worship, I'm going to have to leave, unfortunately. I won't be able to stay for the rest of the meeting.
All right, thank you for letting us know.
Oh, that's okay. Oh, okay.
Mr. Rousseau, we're gonna start again.
Here, I'm gonna give you his name tag though.
Point it towards the camera.
Yeah. Welcome to the cool side.
All right, so departmental updates, Ms. Braun.
So I wanna,
Oh,
so are we, are?
Yes,
Yeah.
so
not in camera.
we're not
We're
in camera. The CAO is going to provide us.
Oh, yeah, well, I was gonna do that after in communications. That's what you had on your stuff. So I'm just following the rules that you gave me.
Yes, but Ms. Braun is not doing her update in the regular agenda.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, good. All right, thank you for that. Okay, well, Mr.
All
CAO,
right,
that
okay.
45-minute presentation you're gonna do.
I'm gonna do it in 5 minutes.
All right.
Because we're gonna be issuing a press release tomorrow, so thank you very much. So before I go into the 4 recommendations on my findings and my review of the snow event of 2022, which descended on our community roughly 23rd, 24th, 25th, 26th of December, followed December 27th. I just want to say a few opening comments to the public and those that are in attendance today. In the spirit of communications and also in the spirit of a commitment to better communications with the public, this review is not intended to be a criticism or highlighting shortcomings or negativity in terms of operations at the city. This is just us reporting out to the citizens that we, the city of Revelstoke, are not going to be defensive. We're not going to hide behind of what happened. We're just here to say, how can we make it better? And I had the great opportunity to meet with staff. I met with Jesse Adam and his crew, who's the road foreman. I met with both Stephen Black and Mike Manson regarding the overall operations of snow removal. I've met with multiple residents via email, phone call, and in person, and also met with our business stakeholders representing the Chamber of Commerce and all the commercial operators in Revelstoke. In fact, they have invited me to their Chamber of Commerce meeting next Wednesday, which I will share these findings with. So moving forward, we just want to open up the communication and report back as to how the city can make snow removal in the future a lot better. So my findings are broken down into 4 recommendations. Number 1, communications. I believe that the city could have issued a communique prior to the snow event, just basically advising the residents that we're expecting a large dump of snow. We are going to, as per the snow removal policy, we are going to attack the arterial roads, the downtown core, bus routes, and city-owned parking lots. However, please be patient as we hit the residential streets after we attack those key routes. That's actually in the snow removal policy. And could we have issued a simple communique prior to the 23rd, 24th? Of course. We do have a communications committee, which is led by Councillor Orlando, which we will be working with to get more and better communications out there. And it doesn't have to be a very complicated communique. It's just, folks, we're expecting a dump of snow. It is the holidays. We're going to hit the key priority areas first, and we will get to your residential streets subject to resources. Number 2, we have a very dated and outdated snow removal policy. And we have a new Public Works Infrastructure Committee. I believe it is represented by Councillor Palmer and Councillor Luciao. Steve Black, Director of Engineering and Infrastructure and Operations, will be part of that committee to review that snow removal policy. So we bring it up to date to 2023. It was last amended in 2000, correct? So, you know, we're coming up 25 years. I think it's time for the city to have a hard look at that policy because, folks, it's the policy that drives staff. to make the available resources and meet these snow events as per council's directive. And council has a chance to amend any policy on any services. And so that policy I'm going to be sharing with our business leaders when I meet with them and get it out there that we can fine tune it and make it better. Number three, we need to do a better job at the management level, including myself, to make sure that the operators know who's in charge. So this is more of an alert that when the CAO is away and when the director of engineering is away or the director of operations, that the operators know who the designate is, who's in charge. It was very frustrating for the mayor to receive phone calls and emails. And it's like, okay, who do I talk to? Who's the designated person in charge at the management level? So not only does the elected officials know who's in charge, but also the operators know who the designate is in charge. People are away on holidays. I was one of them. You know, it's Christmas. You're not around, and when there's an issue, everyone needs to know, from the elected all the way down to the operators of our great crew, who's in charge, and so we can improve some of those protocols. The fourth one is we have a collective agreement with our partner, and that's CUPE, the Canadian Union of Public Employees. And in our collective agreement, there's language that identifies essential services. We are in our final year of our collective agreement. We're going to be sitting down and bargaining a new collective agreement. And we need to work with our partners that gives the tools to operations that allows staff an opportunity to work on stat holidays when it's their day off. We need more flexibility in the language that mandates, because we're a resort municipality and we're in the middle of our snow season. Boxing Day is a big day. We have to make sure that there's available resources, and the collective agreement doesn't allow management to work with staff to give staff a golden opportunity to work double overtime, triple overtime on days off. Okay. In fact, the language only allows exempt positions that are not subject to statutory work days, only reserved to the rec center. And so we need to include public works and roads that are exempt from enjoying a day off that falls on a stat holiday. It's very restrictive for the city to have workers available when the language in the collective agreement doesn't allow them to do so. So we're going to be tightening that up. The fifth one, I want to give a shout out to the media that immediately advised me via emails and phone calls that they would like to also get the word out to the public. Josh at the Review, Megan at Stoke FM, and Nora at the Mountaineer all reached out and simply said, use us to get the word out, to let people know that there's going to be a delayed service on residential streets while the crew frantically, again, it addresses the main priorities, the arterial roads, the downtown core, bus routes, and parking lots. So I do want to thank those three who did reach out saying, we're here, and maybe this is something moving forward that the city can use and use the media. It's always common in government to think that the media is critical, and I'm talking all platforms. I'm not singling out one, but the media can also be our partner in getting the communication out to the residents by using their established infrastructure and developing a relationship with them. And so I thought it was good that all three immediately responded to me, and they were simply saying, let us help you get the word out. So I want to do a shout out for them. I will be meeting with the Chamber of Commerce next Wednesday at their board meeting. They have put a survey out to their members asking, how can it be better? What kind of problems did you experience over the holidays? How can the chamber lobby and assist the city to make snow removal better? So those are my four sort of recommendations: communications, review the snow removal policy, designated leadership management protocols, and the City of Revelstoke CUPE collective agreement. Lastly, I do want to thank the operators. This is Jesse's crew and Mike Manson's crew for spending the time with me. I learned a lot. I learned that there's microclimates in Revelstoke. There's certain areas that get more snow than others. There's certain things that stop operators from doing their job. And we talked a lot about those things. And so we're gonna, during the review of the policy, sort of tighten up some of those conditions to make it more transparent to the people. We're not here trying to make excuses, but we're just simply saying there are some challenges and here they are, and we're gonna make it better for next time. So I hope people understand that we're committed to reviewing this snow removal policy. With that, I will be releasing the findings of the review tomorrow via a press release. And I am open to any specific questions. If not, you can reach me at any time vis-a-vis this entire either episode over the Christmas or moving forward on snow removal. Thank you.
Any comments, questions for CAO?
Just a comment. I think through the communication, just how the statutory holidays work for the QP workers, because I don't think that was understood by the community. So I think some clarification there would be appreciated.
Sure. Thank you, Councilor Luciao. So how it works is if you have a day off and it's the weekend and it's a stat holiday, the language in the collective agreement means you get the next business day off. So it was tricky this year. Christmas was on Sunday, Boxing Day was Monday, and the 27th was the Tuesday. So how it works is you get, if the stat falls on a weekend, it's the next business day that's the stat day. So that Christmas becomes the Monday stat for Christmas. Monday, which is Boxing Day, defers to Tuesday. So you have back-to-back stat days in 2022. The 25th, the 26th, 27th. Okay? If you're not working that day, the collective agreement says that's your day off and you're not exempt from any other provisions. You have that day off, no different than a normal weekend where a stat falls. Like if it's Remembrance Day on Saturday and it's your day off, I believe you get the Monday off, the following business day. So I've heard the same thing. This year, had Christmas been on a Monday and Boxing Day Tuesday, it would have been 2 days. But this year it was 3 days, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. So that extra 24 hours was that frustration with the residents where there was no snow removal just because the crew had either worked the night shift, some crew were not available because they're spending time with family. And so they deserve their holiday times, but a lot of the crews had worked the shift before and they couldn't work the next shift because like pilots, they time out, they need rest. So this year we had back-to-back stat holidays. And that's something we need to fix when we bargain with our partners moving forward.
And so one of the things with that, my understanding is because not everybody gets Boxing Day as a stat, federal does, and so does our QP. Is that correct?
Yeah, so under our collective agreement, Boxing Day is a stat holiday. And because again, Boxing Day fell on a Monday, it defers to a stat holiday Tuesday because the Monday is in recognition of the Christmas on Sunday. Does that make sense? Yeah. So that's the 3 days. And in our collective agreement, it is recognized that Boxing Day is a stat holiday for all staff, both exempt and union.
Any other comments, questions? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Parliament. I appreciate you looking into the review and the ability to put it out to the public so they can see and hear firsthand what the circumstances were and understand how we're going to move forward. All right, I would like to move in family, correct? Pursuant to section 90.18 and E of the community charter. Someone want to make that motion for me? Councillor Stapenhurst, Councillor Luciao, all in favor?